on the issue of ground forces, let me please remind you first that we have increased the size of the ground forces, the Army and the Marine Corps, by about 15% over the course of this past decade. And that's after having reduced the combined Army and Marine Corps by about 30 to 35% once the Cold War ended. So we reduced by about a third in the 90s, and then we built back up almost half as much again in the last 10 years. So we're still much smaller today than we were during the Cold War, during the 1980s, for example. But the combined strength of the active duty Army and the active duty Marine Corps is nearly 100,000 uniformed personnel greater than it had been, let's say, in the 1990s. Now, I supported this increase for the engagements that we've been involved in. There was no way to do the operation in Iraq over a sustained basis, no way to do the operation in Afghanistan over a sustained basis without increasing these numbers. And we already asked a great deal, probably too much, of our men and women in uniform during the period when we were still building up. And we probably resisted too long, and I am not supportive of Secretary Rumsfeld's resistance to increasing the Army and Marine Corps, which he continued for most of his tenure in office. But we gradually built up, even on an interim basis during the Rumsfeld era, built up further in the Gates period, and as I say, we're now about 15% larger. I'm suggesting, even though I do it reluctantly, that we may have to reverse that 15% increase once the war in Afghanistan begins to wind down. So we go back to Clinton-era levels on the Army and Marine Corps. That is one big strategic concept. It's a simple idea. Didn't take any great creativity to come up with it, and we've been there before. And so you can think through yourselves the implications of this. Obviously, if we were going to have another decade like the one we're now finishing, we probably wouldn't want to go to a smaller Army and Marine Corps. Obviously, if the mission in Afghanistan was going to take a lot longer at 100,000 troops, we would have to delay any consideration of this option. And by the way, I'm not suggesting we should do this next year in any event. I'm suggesting that these kinds of cuts probably most appropriately begin in the next presidential term as the economy hopefully has begun to improve and as the war in Afghanistan has substantially wound down, I hope, by then. It would be a mistake to do these things prematurely. How do we try to modernize weaponry with a more economical approach towards the basic idea of buying new weapons and researching new weapons? Well, today we're spending in the normal peacetime budget about $100 billion a year on defense procurement, about another $80 billion a year on research, development, test, and evaluation, essentially creating the concepts and the prototypes for these weapons. And then we spend several tens of billions more in what used to be called the supplemental budgets, but which have now been folded into the regular budget, the war costs. So we're spending a little more than $200 billion a year on acquisition, broadly defined. And I think there's a possibility of being able to reduce that first by reduced war expenditures and then by perhaps another 10% or so. I think it would be hard to do a lot more than 10%. But if you take the following three ideas as guideposts, I think you might be able to accomplish this. And I'll just mention them now briefly. We can have a fuller discussion later. One is systems where there is redundancy in the way we are modernizing, because we're building several different things accomplishing essentially the same goal. And a good example here would be tactical aircraft modernization, where we're building a Super Hornet for the Navy, planning to build 3 different kinds of F-35 for the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, completing the purchase of the F-22 program, using a lot more drone aircraft than we ever had before, and modernizing munitions that are capable of far more precise attack than had ever been possible in human history. So that full range of modernization efforts is perhaps arguably excessive. It doesn't mean that any one of them is gold-plated or wasteful per se. I'm not trying to critique defense industry or the services, but I'm saying when you do calculated gambles about what's the healthiest way to build a long-term economy that's strong and therefore a national defense posture that's sustainable, you may decide to take some risk and have a little bit less tactical air modernization, as one example. A second guidepost would be programs that go way over cost or otherwise underperform. And this is common sense, and I'm not saying anything radical here. And the Army, to its credit, has adopted some of this philosophy in recent years with some help from the Office of the Secretary of Defense and canceled its so-called Future Combat System, a troubled next generation vehicle system that was probably not doing very well in performance terms or financial terms, and was the sort of thing we need to be willing to relook at, re-scrutinize, and potentially cancel. And that's a very important area as well. And a third and more difficult area is military missions that, while perhaps still within the realm of the feasible, seem less likely than they had been before. And here, a classic example might be Marine Corps amphibious assault. And I say this in the full knowledge that there may be Marines in this room who are going to do some assaulting of me in a minute if I'm not careful, because I don't pretend to suggest that forced entry operations are altogether a thing of the past. But we do have certain capabilities for carrying these out already. And two of the big Marine Corps modernization efforts, the so-called Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle and the Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft, are both, to my mind, dubious ways to further our capabilities in this area. And if it's a mission that may seem to be sort of beyond the heyday of its likely application, this may be also an area of modernization that we're willing to run some more risks. Not because the existing programs are wasteful, but because, again, we've got to introduce a spirit of trading off, perhaps, short-term, calculated gambles about how we can make do with a little bit less to shore up our longer-term economic foundations of national power for the future decades to come.